Hey guys, tonight we begin with a 3,500-ton wooden monster armed with more cannons than sense. The HMS Victory, a floating fortress of oak, iron and questionable hygiene, was the beating heart of the Royal Navy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The HMS Victory was not so much built as it was bullied into existence by the Royal Navy. It was the 1750s, and Britain was in the middle of its favourite hobby, being at war with France. Someone in the Admiralty decided the best way to express national pride was to construct a ship so massive that it would physically intimidate the Atlantic Ocean. So, in 1759, they began her construction at Chatham Dockyard, a place where the air was thick with sawdust, tar, and quiet despair. Building a 3,500-ton warship out of trees required skill, patience, and an indifference to back pain. No one had blueprints. No calculators, just a vague idea, a lot of rum, and a foreman who said, "Aye, look straight enough." The Victory consumed over 6,000 oak trees, because apparently the British Navy measured strength in acres destroyed. Entire forests were flattened, all so one ship could eventually smell like sweat and death. Each plank was cut, steamed, and hammered into shape by men whose dental records could be summarized as no. Occupational safety didn't exist. If you fell into the hold, you just became part of the ship. It took 6 years to finish her, which is impressive considering every tool used was basically a sharp stick. When launched in 1765, she was a 214-foot wooden skyscraper, capable of carrying 104 guns and 800 angry men. Her hull was thick enough to shrug off small cannon fire and, unfortunately, most forms of logic. The ship's masts stood taller than a modern apartment block, supporting 37 sails and miles of rigging, a marvel of engineering, and an absolute nightmare to untangle. The Victory didn't so much sail as she loomed menacingly across the water. Her top speed was about 8 knots, which means you could probably jog faster if you were feeling motivated. Still, she was a masterpiece, elegant, terrifying, and entirely unnecessary. When she finally touched water, one witness reportedly gasped at her size. The rest probably wondered who would be foolish enough to actually live on the thing. Thus began the life of the HMS Victory, the greatest floating death trap ever carved out of wood and national overconfidence. Building a ship like the HMS Victory was not just a feat of engineering. It was a masterclass in collective denial. The 18th century didn't have computers, calculators, or even reliable measuring tools. Shipwrights relied on instinct, hand-drawn curves, and a centuries-old method called hope. Every beam, plank, and nail was guessed into place by men who'd never heard of ergonomics. The plans were stored in someone's head, usually the oldest man on site, who could remember numbers up until lunchtime. It's a miracle the ship floated at all, though some historians suspect witchcraft. The hull was designed to withstand broadsides, storms, and the occasional collision with France. Its ribs, great curved oak timbers, were bent by fire, steam, and bad language. Then came the caulking. Tar, pitch, and hemp jammed into every seam until it was watertight or someone gave up. If you've ever built IKEA furniture while drunk, you've come close to understanding 18th century shipbuilding. The lower decks were a maze of beams and bulkheads so tightly packed that sailors had to walk hunched over, like goblins on vacation. Every inch of space had a purpose. Cannon storage, gunpowder magazines, rum barrels, or simply a place for rats to judge you. Ventilation was a suggestion, not a reality. To support the weight of 104 cannons, the ship's frame was built thick enough to stop small artillery, or at least slow it down so you could die more dramatically. Iron bolts held the whole structure together, which is impressive considering England's finest blacksmiths were working with tools last sharpened during the Crusades. And yet, somehow, it worked. The Victory was strong enough to survive storms, gunfire, and 800 men trying to ruin it simultaneously. When the last plank was nailed and the ship slid down the slipway, the crowd erupted in cheers, mostly because it hadn't immediately sunk. She was an engineering triumph for her time, a perfect balance of physics, craftsmanship, and sheer audacity. The world looked at her and thought, "This is the future." And the sailors who would later serve on her probably thought, "This is how I die." Before the age of engines, the ocean ran on wind, rope, and unreasonable optimism. The HMS Victory was powered by over 37 sails, which together created enough surface area to cover a football field, or, in British terms, 2.5 pubs. These sails didn't just move the ship, they controlled her mood. A favourable breeze meant progress. No wind meant you drifted in circles, questioning your life choices. Controlling that much canvas took a small army. Over 26 miles of rope held the rigging together. That's roughly the distance from Portsmouth to a sailor's patience. Each rope had a name and a job, which made sense until you realised there were hundreds of them. The average sailor spent half his life hauling lines he didn't understand, while an officer screamed something vague like, "Brace the main topsail!" Everyone pretended they knew what that meant. Victory's masts were the skyscrapers of their day, 3 colossal wooden towers reaching nearly 200 feet high. Sailors had to climb them daily, barefoot, in storms, on ropes slick with rain and salt. One slip, and you'd meet the sea face first, at terminal velocity. No safety harnesses, no sympathy. Just a brief splash and your replacement already waiting below. The rigging was a living machine, pulleys, blocks, and ropes working in manic harmony. Adjusting the sails wasn't a calm process. It was chaos with choreography. Orders were shouted, ropes yanked, and the entire crew moved like a caffeinated centipede. If everything went right, the ship turned. If not, it broke something expensive. The wind was both the engine and the enemy. Too little, and you were stranded. Too much, and your sails ripped apart like divine punishment. There was no off button, only the illusion of control. Every voyage was a gamble against weather, luck, and that one guy who couldn't tie knots properly. Still, when everything worked, it was a sight to behold. 37 sails billowing, ropes singing, timbers groaning as 3,500 tons of oak carved through the waves like an angry cathedral. It was magnificent, terrifying, and deeply inefficient. Exactly how Britain liked its navy. The HMS Victory wasn't just a ship. It was a vertical neighbourhood with trust issues. From her towering masts to her dank rat-filled bilges, every inch had a purpose, and most of those purposes involved suffering. From the outside, she looked like a graceful beast of empire. Inside, she was more like a wooden filing cabinet packed with human misery and gunpowder. The decks were stacked like layers of lasagna, elegant on top, horrifying underneath. The upper deck was where sunlight, air, and sanity briefly existed. Officers paced about in fine coats, pretending not to notice that their ship constantly smelled like death, salt, and old cheese. This was also where the wheel stood, a massive piece of oak connected by ropes to the rudder far below. Steering the ship required both muscle and prayer. If you sneezed wrong, you could change direction. Beneath that lay the quarterdeck and gun decks, where cannons sat like oversized metal toddlers waiting for attention. Each gun had its own little crew, its own name, and its own grudge against the French. The ceilings were so low that even average-sized sailors had to crouch. Taller ones simply learned to live with a mild concussion. Further down was the orlop deck, a gloomy labyrinth of ropes, barrels, and despair. Here lay the powder magazines, a cosy collection of explosives carefully guarded from open flames, cigarettes, and optimism. The surgeon's table was also down here, because nothing boosts morale like hearing someone being sawed in half next to the rum supply. And at the very bottom, the hold, the ship's stomach. It was filled with salted meat, barrels of biscuit, spare rope, and enough rats to qualify as passengers. The air was warm, moist, and unholy. You could smell it from a deck away, which is why most sailors tried to stay topside, even in storms. Walking through Victory was like touring a wooden ecosystem. Part fortress, part prison, part death trap. Every deck creaked, every rope hummed, every plank whispered, you could drown at any moment. She wasn't comfortable, but she was magnificent. The 18th century's version of a luxury cruise, if you removed the luxury, the choice, and the will to live. To sail the HMS Victory, you needed people. Lots of them. Around 850 souls in total, which sounds impressive until you realise that roughly half were there because someone tricked or kidnapped them. The Royal Navy called it press ganging. Everyone else called it Tuesday. A volunteer in the 18th century didn't always mean willing participant. Naval recruiters patrolled ports armed with clubs, rum, and loose ethics. One moment you were enjoying a quiet pint, the next you woke up at sea, missing a shoe, a tooth, and all legal rights. Congratulations. You were now serving His Majesty. Once aboard, the crew became a finely tuned ecosystem of misery and hierarchy. At the top were the officers, educated, powdered, and convinced they were better than everyone else. Below them were the petty officers and specialists, carpenters, sailmakers, gunners, and the ship's cook, whose main job was disguising despair as soup. Then came the ratings, the backbone of the ship and the people most likely to die doing something stupid with rope. They did everything, hauling sails, scrubbing decks, pumping bilge water, and pretending to understand orders shouted in hurricane-force winds. The youngest aboard were powder monkeys, boys as young as 12 who carried gunpowder between decks during battle. Their main qualification was being small enough to fit between cannon and chaos. Childhood in the Navy was short, loud, and occasionally explosive. Pay was theoretically decent, but the Navy rarely paid on time. Some men served entire voyages without seeing a penny, which explains why mutiny was always on the menu. Still, the Admiralty offered incentives: rum rations, dental neglect, and the chance to die gloriously for the King. And yet, despite the brutality, something about shipboard life bound these men together. Maybe it was the shared hardship. Maybe it was the lack of escape routes. By the time the Victory set sail, 850 strangers had become one collective organism. Part machine, part mob, held together by routine, duty, and sheer exhaustion. They didn't all join willingly, but they all stayed alive the same way. Follow orders, don't question authority, and never stand under the poop deck during rough weather. If heaven had chandeliers and marble floors, then life below deck on the HMS Victory was the opposite. Imagine 800 men packed into a wooden box with ceilings barely 5 feet high, eating salted meat beside live gunpowder, and you're getting close. Below deck there was no light, just the soft glow of lanterns, flickering through smoke, sweat, and general regret. The air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of damp oak, tobacco, tar, and about 700 different body odours, forming a unique ecosystem. Even rats found it overwhelming and occasionally moved to better neighbourhoods. Sleeping arrangements were simple. Hammocks hung in rows so close together that turning over was considered an act of violence. Each man had about 14 inches of personal space, less than a coffin, and only slightly more comfortable. At night, the creaking wood and rolling sea turned the ship into a living organism, groaning like a snoring whale with indigestion. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone ate, slept, argued, and suffered in the same open space. Conversations were shouted over the sound of cannons being cleaned, barrels rolling, and some poor soul vomiting into a bucket. If you were lucky enough to have a quiet night, it just meant you could hear the rats chewing on your shoes. Bathing was theoretical. Fresh water was too precious to waste on hygiene, so sailors cleaned themselves with seawater, which was essentially bathing in other people's mistakes. Clothes were rarely washed, which gave the crew a consistent look and smell, both described by historians as noticeable. To make things worse, the bilge, the ship's lowest part, collected every leak, spill, and mystery fluid imaginable. The stench could peel paint. Pumping it out was a daily chore, usually assigned to whoever had annoyed the bosun that morning. Yet, somehow, men survived down here for months, even years. They joked, they sang, they drank, and occasionally remembered what daylight looked like. In this damp, claustrophobic nightmare, camaraderie became currency. It was filthy, dark, and dangerous. But to the men of the Victory, it was home. A floating, leaking, disease-ridden home, powered entirely by rum and delusion. If you ever wondered what sustained the mighty Royal Navy, the answer is simple: salt, alcohol, and misplaced confidence. The HMS Victory was a triumph of naval engineering, but an absolute catastrophe for human digestion. The ship's food supply was designed for survival, not satisfaction. Sailors ate what was known as the standard ration, which sounded official but tasted like punishment. Every day they were issued salted beef or pork, ship's biscuit, and something optimistically called peas pudding, a beige paste that looked like despair and tasted like betrayal. The meat had been salted so heavily it could outlive the crew. The biscuits were so hard you had to soak them in beer before eating, which conveniently doubled as dental work. Fresh food. That existed for about 3 days after leaving port. After that, the Victory became a floating warehouse of non-perishable sadness. Fruits and vegetables were mythical concepts, known only from stories. The result? Scurvy, a disease that made your gums rot faster than your morale. The ship's cook operated out of a brick oven built into the galley. Meals were boiled in one massive cauldron, where meat, vegetables, and occasionally socks were cooked together into an unholy stew. It wasn't exactly fine dining, it was more like edible recycling. But the real fuel of the British Navy wasn't food, it was rum. Every sailor received a daily ration mixed with water, a concoction known as grog. Officially, it boosted morale and killed bacteria. Unofficially, it made everyone forget how bad the food was. The men drank so much that the ship was basically half war machine, half bar fight. Beer was also common, though by the tropics it turned into something that could strip paint. Water was stored in casks that quickly went green. Sailors would drink it anyway because at least it wasn't peas pudding. So, breakfast was regret, lunch was survival, and dinner was a coin toss with food poisoning. Yet somehow, they thrived. The Victory's crew didn't just endure these meals, they toasted to them every single day, proving once again that the British Empire was built on oak, gunpowder, and digestive fortitude. When you cram 850 men into a wooden box and hand them rum and gunpowder, something magical happens: chaos. To keep the HMS Victory from turning into a floating riot, the Royal Navy relied on one thing: discipline, enforced with creativity and leather. Rules on board covered everything from desertion to whistling. Desertion was obvious. Men occasionally tried to swim to France mid-voyage, but whistling was banned because it confused the wind. Yes, they genuinely thought the breeze might get jealous. The Admiralty had many fears, and logic wasn't one of them. At the centre of this grand system of misery stood the boatswain, or bosun. Part foreman, part executioner, all terrifying. His weapon of choice was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, designed not just to hurt, but to rearrange your spine. The bosun carried it like a fashion accessory, always ready to remind the crew that pain builds character. Punishments were held on the main deck, in full view of everyone. A sailor found guilty of theft, laziness, or existing too loudly would be tied to a grating, shirt off, and receive anywhere from 12 to 100 lashes. The first few drew blood, the rest drew a crowd. Afterwards, rum was issued, not to dull the pain, but to keep the audience entertained. Lesser crimes earned creative alternatives: being keel-hauled, dragged under the ship through barnacles, having your head shaved, or being tied to the mast as decoration. In a place where boredom was deadly, punishment was basically live entertainment. Ironically, this brutality worked. Mutinies were rare on the Victory, partly because everyone was too tired to rebel. Sailors learned early that obedience meant survival, and survival meant one more day of terrible food, questionable water, and existential dread. Officers, of course, rarely faced punishment, unless you count paperwork. They preferred to enforce order with yelling, sarcasm, and a lot of hand-waving. The boatswain handled the rest. In short, the Victory ran on fear, rope, and morale that could be flogged back into shape. It wasn't democracy, it wasn't justice, but it kept 3,500 tons of oak moving forward, and that was all that mattered. While the common sailors of the HMS Victory lived like damp sardines, the officers existed in a different reality. A world of polished brass, decent food, and powdered wigs so flammable they technically counted as hazards. The class divide on a warship was as clear as the smell difference between decks. At the top sat the captain, a mix of monarch, school principal, and motivational speaker with a sword. His word was law, his cabin was spacious, and his bed had actual sheets, a luxury that probably made half the crew cry in silence. He dined on silverware, used glass plates, and had a private bathroom, a hole in the side of the ship that was his and his alone. True privilege. Below him were the lieutenants, professional officers who ensured that everyone else's lives remained miserable. They were trained, disciplined, and fluent in shouting. Their main duties included navigation, discipline, and pretending to care about the weather. In the evenings, they wrote letters home about the glory of naval service, leaving out the part where they screamed at teenagers on a floating death trap. Then came the midshipmen, young gentlemen in training, often from noble families. They were basically interns with uniforms, not yet officers, but already too good to talk to the crew. Their education involved studying navigation, ship handling, and the fine art of avoiding splinters. Most were under 18, which explains the number of questionable decisions made during battle. The warrant officers, like the ship's carpenter, gunner, and sailmaker, were the technical brains of the operation. They lived somewhere between the officers and the crew, socially speaking, close enough to privilege to smell it, but not enough to afford soap. Daily life for officers was routine: paperwork, inspections, and endless tea. They dined in the wardroom, enjoying real food, salted meat with seasoning, while the crew gnawed on biscuits downstairs. Conversations were polite, except when they weren't, which was often. Alcohol helped. They ruled through confidence, etiquette, and the occasional public flogging. The ship was their kingdom, and the men below deck were both their subjects and their nightmare fuel. On land, they were gentlemen. At sea, they were gods. But gods still prayed, mostly that no one would find out how much of their authority depended on rum, shouting, and good posture. If the HMS Victory had a wellness department, it was run by a man with a saw. The ship's surgeon was part doctor, part carpenter, and part psychologist, mostly for himself. His workspace was the orlop deck, the darkest, lowest, and least ventilated part of the ship, conveniently located next to the gunpowder magazine. Because nothing says safe surgery like operating beside several tons of explosives. During battle, the orlop transformed into a scene that made nightmares blush. Lanterns swung wildly, while the surgeon and his mates worked at lightning speed, sometimes literally by lightning, depending on the storm. Men were carried down on stretchers, often minus a few parts. The surgeon's tools were simple: a saw, a knife, some cloth, and the kind of emotional detachment that can only come from prolonged exposure to screaming. Anesthetics didn't exist yet. Pain relief consisted of rum, a piece of leather to bite, and screaming loud enough to drown out the cannons. Amputations were common and fast, about 2 minutes if the surgeon was in good form. Stopping to be gentle was considered inefficient. The goal was to keep the patient alive long enough to feel grateful later, which they rarely did. The discarded limbs piled up like firewood and were unceremoniously tossed overboard, which probably confused the sharks into thinking humans were the new seafood trend. The deck itself was soaked in blood, seawater, and the faint odour of existential dread. The surgeon's assistants, loblolly boys, often teenagers, were responsible for holding down patients and mopping up whatever was left. It built character. Outside of battle, the surgeon's duties were only slightly less horrifying. He treated scurvy, dysentery, infected wounds, and anything else that made sailors regret being alive. The ship's medicine chest was a tragic joke. Mercury for everything, leeches for flavour. When supplies ran out, imagination took over. And yet, for all its horrors, the orlop deck saved lives. The surgeon, equal parts hero and lunatic, held the line between agony and oblivion, armed with nothing but a saw, courage, and blind faith in bleeding people until they felt better. Health insurance wasn't invented yet, but even if it had been, no one would have dared file a claim. When the HMS Victory went into battle, it stopped being a ship and became a thunderstorm made of oak and iron. The order, beat to quarters, meant every man ran, or rather limped, to his assigned station. Drums rolled, bells clanged, and suddenly the whole vessel sounded like a marching band having a panic attack. The decks erupted into motion. Gunners hauled their cannons into position, each weighing as much as a car, each demanding a crew of 6 to operate. It was like an orchestra, if the instruments all exploded. Powder monkeys, terrified boys barely in their teens, darted through the smoke, carrying gunpowder cartridges from the magazine. One spark, and they'd be scattered across the channel faster than a French retreat. Loading a cannon was an art form performed entirely under pressure. Sponge, load, ram, aim, pray, fire. The gun recoiled back several feet, the air filled with black smoke, and everyone pretended their eardrums weren't dissolving. The smell of burnt powder mixed with sweat, blood, and splinters. Visibility dropped to nothing. At that point, you weren't fighting the enemy. You were fighting physics and hoping the ship didn't catch fire. Above deck, officers shouted orders that no one could hear. Below deck, men shouted prayers that no one answered. Cannonballs screamed through the air, tearing through wood, limbs, and any lingering optimism. The ship groaned with every hit, a massive living thing in agony, yet still charging forward. Amid the chaos, there was no retreat, no break, no 5-minute water interval. Battles could last for hours. Gunners fought until their hands blistered, the deck slick with blood and seawater. If someone fell, someone else stepped over them, not out of cruelty, but necessity. You couldn't stop to grieve when the ship itself was trying to explode. And when the order came, "Cease fire!" silence hit harder than the cannons ever did. Smoke hung like fog. The wounded groaned below, and the crew blinked in disbelief that they were still floating. That was naval warfare in the 18th century. No glory, no clean victories, just thunder, terror, and the faint hope that the other guy was having a slightly worse time than you. October 21st, 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, a day that would turn the HMS Victory into legend and Admiral Horatio Nelson into a national myth. Off the coast of Spain, 27 British ships faced 33 French and Spanish ones. Because the Royal Navy never believed in fair fights, just effective ones, the Victory led the charge. Nelson's plan was revolutionary: sail directly at the enemy line, break it in two, and cause as much chaos as humanly possible. It was the 18th century version of driving into traffic for tactical advantage. His men were terrified. Nelson, of course, was dressed like a golden chandelier. Medals, sashes, and enough gold braid to make him a visible target from space. Subtlety was not his strength. As the Victory advanced, enemy cannon fire tore through her sails and rigging. Splinters, not bullets, splinters, flew like shrapnel, slicing through flesh. The air filled with choking smoke, thunder, and profanity. When she finally broke the French line, she unleashed a full broadside, a wall of fire and iron that ripped into the enemy flagship. The noise was biblical. The carnage, worse. Amid the chaos, Nelson paced the deck calmly, directing the battle like a man playing chess with cannonballs. Then, fate obliged history. A French sharpshooter perched high in the rigging fired a single musket ball. It struck Nelson in the shoulder, passed through his spine, and ended the most dramatic career in naval history. He was carried below deck, where he refused morphine, because British heroism apparently required maximum suffering. As the battle raged, the Victory kept firing, deafening, relentless, unstoppable. When it was finally over, 22 enemy ships were captured or sunk. Not a single British ship lost. It was a slaughter disguised as strategy. Nelson died 3 hours later, murmuring, "Thank God I have done my duty," which, loosely translated, means, "You're welcome, England." The battle ended the threat of Napoleon's invasion and made the Victory immortal. But her decks were a butcher's floor, over 100 dead, hundreds more wounded, and splinters thick enough to start a lumber business. Trafalgar was triumph wrapped in tragedy. The day the Victory lived up to her name, and Nelson became the most famous corpse in British history. When the cannons finally stopped, the HMS Victory floated in a fog of smoke, splinters, and disbelief. The silence was deafening, not because the men wanted peace, but because most of them were temporarily deaf. The Battle of Trafalgar was over, and somehow Britain had won. The French and Spanish fleets were in ruins. The sea was red with debris and regret, and the Victory herself was still afloat. Barely. The ship looked like it had been chewed on by Neptune himself. Sails hung in tatters, masts cracked, and rigging dangled like a giant spiderweb after a bad night. Dozens of cannon ports were shattered, and the decks were slick with blood, seawater, and rum. It was a masterpiece of destruction, and the Royal Navy called it success. Nelson's body lay below deck, preserved in a cask of brandy for the journey home. It was the 19th century equivalent of cryogenics, just much stickier. The men toasted his name with the same rum that was preserving him, because sailors have always understood efficiency. Above, the crew worked through exhaustion to repair the ship. The dead were sewn into hammocks, weighted with cannonballs, and slid into the sea. Tradition dictated that the last stitch went through the nose, just to be absolutely sure they were, in fact, dead. The ceremony was short. The smell demanded it. The wounded moaned below deck, while the surgeon, now running on pure caffeine and trauma, worked without rest. Amputation, rum, repeat. For many, the real battle began after the fighting stopped. Infection was more ruthless than any cannonball, yet, amid the ruin, the Victory still lived up to her name. Her crew cheered through cracked lips and bloody bandages. They had defeated 2 navies at once, a feat so absurd that even history applauded. By nightfall, the sea calmed, and the surviving ships of Nelson's fleet drifted among the wreckage. The Victory led them home, battered but unbowed, the floating embodiment of the British Empire's favourite motto. We win, but at what cost? Don't ask. The battle had ended, but the legend had just begun, forged from splinters, smoke, and the faint smell of brandy. After Trafalgar, the HMS Victory had earned eternal glory and permanent back pain. She limped home to Portsmouth, a floating wreck held together by prayer, tar, and several hundred sarcastic sailors. Her fighting days were over, but retirement wasn't exactly relaxing. The Royal Navy didn't do rest. They did reassignment. First, she became a harbour ship, stripped of her sails and dignity, used as a floating barracks and storage depot. Imagine being one of history's most famous warships and spending your golden years as a glorified warehouse. The Victory went from delivering broadsides to delivering spare rope. The only thing she battled now was rot. By the mid-19th century, time had taken its toll. Her hull sagged, her masts cracked, and her timbers groaned like an old man getting out of bed. The Admiralty considered scrapping her, a bold move that nearly caused national outrage. Even politicians realised you can't just throw away the ship that saved Britain, no matter how many barnacles it had. Instead, they decided to preserve her, which in 19th century terms meant doing as little as possible and hoping for the best. For decades, she sat in dock, slowly decomposing in full view of tourists who described her as historic and smelling oddly like rum and despair. Then came the 20th century, when Britain realised nostalgia could be monetised. In 1922, the Victory was moved into a dry dock and officially declared a national treasure, mostly because she was too fragile to float anymore. Restoration began, which involved carpenters muttering, "How is this thing still standing?" for several decades. During World War II, she was bombed by the Luftwaffe, because even after 150 years, the Victory couldn't take a day off from being attacked. Miraculously, she survived again, probably out of spite. Today, she remains in Portsmouth Dockyard, the world's oldest commissioned warship still afloat, technically. She's part museum, part miracle, and part architectural guessing game. Her decks have been polished, her guns rebrassed, and her smell, well, that's permanent. She no longer sails, but she still commands awe. The Victory endures as a reminder that Britain once built ships so tough, even time gave up trying to sink them. The HMS Victory may rest quietly today, but her ghost still creaks through every naval museum, sea shanty, and overpriced souvenir shop in Britain. She is the last echo of an era when humans tried to conquer the oceans, armed with nothing but wind, wood, and misplaced confidence. Standing aboard her now, you can almost hear the chorus of the past. The crack of cannon fire, the groan of timbers, and the distant yelling of someone being flogged for whistling. Every plank is a fossil of endurance, proof that humanity once built machines so magnificent they somehow worked despite everyone involved being half drunk. In her time, the Victory was the internet, the nuclear deterrent, and the national pride of an empire all rolled into one creaky oak hull. She didn't just win battles. She helped Britain redefine the meaning of too much effort. With her, the Royal Navy mastered global logistics centuries before Google Maps, navigating with sextants, guesswork, and sheer arrogance. But the Victory's legacy isn't just in her victories. It's in the men who endured her, the carpenters who rebuilt her after every storm, the surgeons who operated in darkness, the sailors who tied ropes until their hands bled and still found the energy to sing about it afterward. Their lives were short, brutal, and astonishingly loud, but they kept the engines of empire turning. The age of sail itself ended quietly, replaced by steam, steel, and the modern idea that engines should do the sweating for us. Yet the Victory remains, defiantly wooden in a world of metal. She's a time capsule of human willpower, craftsmanship, and masochism. Today, she sits in dry dock, polished and preserved, a national monument to courage and poor life choices. Schoolchildren file through her decks, amazed that anyone survived life aboard. Historians call her a masterpiece. Former sailors would probably call her uncomfortable housing with artillery, and so she endures, not just as a relic, but as a reminder that once, long before electricity, humans built a machine capable of crossing oceans, toppling empires, and ruining everyone's hearing, all powered by wind, sweat, and one very stubborn nation's refusal to sink. It was 327 BCE, deep in the unforgiving mountains of Sogdiana. The air was thin, the terrain cruel, and Alexander's army, exhausted but unbroken, finally brought the rebel stronghold known as the Sogdian Rock to its knees. This fortress had been considered impregnable, perched high upon sheer cliffs where even birds seemed reluctant to land. But Alexander, ever the showman of conquest, scaled it with a handful of his most daring climbers. By dawn, the banner of Macedon fluttered atop the summit. Below, the defenders stared in disbelief as the impossible had once again been achieved. Among the captured nobles was Oxyates, a Bactrian satrap, and with him his daughter, Roxana. Ancient sources claim she was more than just beautiful. She was luminous, with features that carried both Eastern grace and fierce dignity. Her name, Roxana, meant little star. To the Macedonian soldiers, she was just another trophy of war. To Alexander, she became something entirely different. an unexpected reflection of the world he was trying to build. When she was brought before him, veiled and trembling, Alexander saw not a captive but a symbol. After years of relentless campaigns, endless bloodshed and crumbling cities, here stood the embodiment of everything he had fought to unite: East and West, Persia and Greece, empire and dream. His generals expected her to be claimed as spoils, as was custom. But Alexander, raised on Homer and philosophy, was a man who wanted to conquer hearts as much as lands. He ordered her treated with honour. That night, in his camp amid the flicker of torchlight, he could not shake her image. She represented something new, a peace that did not come from submission, but from union. Soon the conqueror who had taken Babylon, Susa and Persepolis would take Roxana's hand, not as a prisoner, but as a bride. For the first time in years, Alexander's ambitions turned inward. No longer just toward maps and battles, but toward legacy. His marriage to Roxana would become more than a love story. It would be a declaration. The boy from Macedon, who had set out to rule the world, had finally found someone who made him want to rule it together. The story of Alexander and Roxana truly begins not on a battlefield, but in a quiet tent surrounded by the aftermath of victory. The dust of Sogdiana had barely settled when Oxyates, seeking mercy, presented his daughter to the Macedonian king. She entered Alexander's tent veiled, flanked by guards who expected the usual display of arrogance and conquest. Instead, what followed stunned even them. Ancient writers like Arrian and Curtius Rufus described the moment with a kind of reverence. Roxana was said to have unveiled herself briefly, not out of vanity, but of courage. She was young, perhaps 16, her dark eyes calm and defiant. Her silk dress shimmered in soft Bactrian gold, and her jewellery glinted faintly in the lamplight. To Alexander, who had spent his adult life amid men, maps, and battles, her presence was disarming. He had seen queens and courtesans before, but this was different. She carried herself like a warrior's daughter, neither begging nor boasting, simply existing with a poise that silenced the room. For a fleeting moment, the conqueror who had stood face to face with kings and prophets found himself wordless. The men around him, rough Macedonians who'd raised empires, exchanged glances, waiting for their commander's reaction. Would he claim her, as custom dictated? Or would he add her to his harem, like so many Persian nobles had done? Instead, Alexander smiled, a rare, boyish expression breaking through the iron mask of command, and ordered that she be treated with respect. To those who watched, it seemed as though lightning had struck. His closest companions, Hephaestion among them, understood immediately. This was no fleeting attraction. Something had shifted in their king. The conqueror of the world had just been conquered by a girl from Bactria. That night, Alexander reportedly compared her beauty to that of the goddesses, not as a flatterer, but as a philosopher seeking symbols. For him, Roxana was more than a woman. She was an idea, a living image of unity, grace, and destiny. In her eyes, he saw the East he longed to understand. And for a man who had built his life on bridging worlds, this moment, this glance, would change everything. The marriage that would follow would not simply unite two people, but two civilizations. And it began with a single look. When Alexander announced his intention to marry Roxana, his generals nearly choked on their wine. It was not uncommon for kings to take foreign brides. But this wasn't just any king, and this wasn't just any bride. She was a Bactrian noble's daughter, a woman from a land that had fought tooth and nail against him. To Macedonian soldiers who had bled for years in Asia, she represented the enemy. Yet Alexander, with that serene, stubborn look he often wore when defying tradition, simply declared, "She is the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and I will marry her." The ceremony was unlike any the Macedonians had witnessed. It took place in the traditional Persian style, not the loud, wine-drenched festivities of Greece, but a ritual of elegance and symbolism. In the presence of his officers, Alexander drew his sword, cut a loaf of bread in two, and shared it with Roxana. a gesture of union both simple and sacred. There were no golden thrones, no divine proclamations, just the conqueror and the captured princess, joined by bread and destiny. Whispers rippled through the camp. Some called it love at first sight, others saw politics. To unite East and West, Alexander needed more than conquest, he needed legitimacy. By marrying a local noblewoman, he bound himself to the Persian elite, signalling to the East that he was not merely their ruler, but one of their own. But perhaps there was something more human at play. For a man who had conquered half the known world by his mid-20s, Alexander had known little intimacy, little softness. Roxana brought both. She shared his tent, his meals, and his long silences. Unlike the courtiers and philosophers, she never flattered him, and he admired that. In the tapestry of Alexander's life, their wedding marked a turning point, a pause amid conquest, a fragile peace between ambition and affection. Around them, empires shifted and armies prepared for new campaigns, but for one night, beneath the desert stars of Bactria, the great king was simply a man, and the most powerful man on earth bowed to love. In the eyes of Alexander's court, the marriage to Roxana was more than an act of affection. It was a masterstroke of empire building. To unite Macedonian steel with Persian silk, Alexander needed more than military victories. He needed symbols of harmony. Roxana, the daughter of a respected Bactrian noble, offered him precisely that, legitimacy in the eyes of the East. By wedding her, Alexander presented himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a successor to Darius and Cyrus, embracing Persian customs instead of erasing them. He began dressing in Persian robes, hosting banquets where Greek philosophers dined beside Persian satraps, and insisting his officers perform the Persian act of proskynesis, bowing before the king. To the Persians, it was a gesture of respect. To the Macedonians, it was humiliation. Whispers began to swirl in the campfires of his restless soldiers. Some called Roxana the Eastern witch who had ensnared their king. Others believed Alexander had lost himself in a haze of foreign luxury. Soft pillows, perfumed halls, and the smile of a woman who had never known the dust of Macedon. But Alexander, always a man of vision, ignored them. He told his closest friends that his marriage was not a sign of weakness, but of peace, that empires could be ruled through love as much as through fear. And yet, beneath the surface, tensions brewed. His generals, especially those who still longed for the simplicity of conquest, viewed the union as a dangerous precedent. They wanted spoils, not diplomacy, submission, not marriage. For them, Roxana represented the creeping influence of an alien world. Still, Alexander stood firm. He was shaping a new identity. Not the son of Philip of Macedon, but the ruler of a blended civilization. In Roxana, he saw not just beauty, but the promise of a future where East and West would become one. To him, she was the living embodiment of his greatest dream, that the world could be conquered not only by the sword, but by unity. What his men failed to understand was that this love, political or not, would ripple through history long after the dust of their campaigns had settled. Roxana's new life as queen was a strange mixture of splendour and solitude. She had gone from the daughter of a provincial noble to the wife of the most powerful man alive, yet she lived surrounded by people who despised her. The Macedonian nobles whispered in Greek behind her back, calling her the barbarian bride. To them, she was an intruder, a reminder that their king's heart now belonged to Asia. In the glittering courts of Bactria and Susa, Roxana learned quickly that royal power was not just a matter of birth, but of survival. She was young, intelligent, and cautious. She spoke little, observed everything, and learned to navigate the dangerous court politics that surrounded Alexander. His empire stretched from Greece to India, but his generals were restless, his soldiers homesick, and his mother, Olympia's, an unpredictable storm waiting back in Macedon. Roxana's greatest asset was her proximity to Alexander. When he travelled, she often accompanied him. She dined with him, prayed with him, and shared the quiet moments between battles. Ancient writers note that he treated her with affection, even tenderness, something he rarely showed others. He would take her hand during banquets, or smile at her during councils, gestures that, to the hardened Macedonians, seemed almost scandalous. But Roxana's position remained perilous. Alexander's previous dalliances with noble Persian women, like the daughters of Darius, left her uneasy. They were royal, prestigious, and she, despite her charm, came from lesser nobility. Her jealousy, whispered the chroniclers, was fierce and immediate. It was said she demanded that no rival woman dine or rest near him. Some dismissed this as rumour, others saw it as proof of her will, the same iron beneath her grace that had once made her father's fortress defy an empire. In the grand halls of Asia, where Alexander's vision of fusion between East and West glittered like a dream, Roxana stood at its fragile centre. She was both symbol and survivor, a woman who loved a godlike conqueror, yet understood that his love was as dangerous as his sword. And in that understanding, she began to play her role not just as queen, but as a force quietly shaping destiny. As Alexander's ambitions stretched beyond Persia into the fabled lands of India, Roxana followed, not as a passive queen, but as a symbol of loyalty and unity. The march was brutal, months under a blazing sun, soldiers wading through monsoon-soaked jungles and desert heat. Many thought she would stay behind in safety, but Roxana refused. To remain in Bactria would mean being forgotten, sidelined among the women of his court. Beside him, she remained visible, a constant reminder that this conqueror was also a husband. Their journey through the Hindu Kush was a test of endurance and will. Men froze in the mountain passes, elephants slipped on narrow trails, and supplies dwindled. But Alexander, ever defiant of limits, pressed on. In their rare moments of rest, he and Roxana would camp under the stars. Chroniclers imagined them speaking softly of the future, a world united under their reign, where Greek philosophers and Eastern priests would debate under the same roof. Yet beneath these dreams, tension pulsed. The soldiers, now far from home and weary of conquest, grew resentful. They murmured that their king had become more Persian than Macedonian, wearing silk robes, adopting foreign customs, and keeping a foreign queen. Even the bond between Alexander and his men, once forged in fire and loyalty, began to fray. Still, Roxana endured. Her beauty and dignity impressed even the skeptics among Alexander's companions. She was present at the Battle of the Hydaspes, when Alexander faced King Porus, a colossal confrontation fought in rain and blood. After the victory, Alexander ordered that Porus be treated honourably, much to the astonishment of his generals. Some whispered that it was Roxana's influence, that her Eastern sensibility, her understanding of pride and mercy, had softened him. But the triumphs of India came with a cost. As Alexander's empire expanded, so did his isolation. Each victory seemed to draw him further from the young general who had once wept for new worlds to conquer. Roxana watched it all, the feverish ambition, the divine delusion growing behind his eyes. She loved him still, but she began to understand what few dared to admit. Her husband was no longer just a man. He was a myth in the making, and myths, she knew, never end peacefully. By 323 BCE, the road of conquest had finally led Alexander back to Babylon, the ancient city of kings and gods, where the rivers shimmered with wealth and the air itself seemed heavy with history. It was here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, that the world's greatest conqueror began to unravel. The endless campaigns had taken their toll. Fever, exhaustion, and perhaps fate itself began to close in. Roxana, now visibly pregnant, accompanied him as he planned new expeditions, this time to conquer Arabia. Even in frailty, Alexander dreamed of worlds yet unconquered. At night, Babylon's palace echoed with banquets and music, but the laughter was hollow. His generals whispered of mutiny. His soldiers longed for Macedon. Alexander himself began to drift between grand visions and grim silence. Some said he saw omens, ravens circling the palace, strange winds that blew out lamps during ceremonies. Roxana, ever watchful, tried to shield him from intrigue, but even she sensed something was changing. When Hephaestion, his closest companion, and perhaps the only man he ever truly trusted, died suddenly of fever, Alexander's grief turned to madness. He ordered massive funeral rites, demanding that cities be levelled in Hephaestion's honour. Roxana stayed by his side, offering comfort, but also fearing the growing instability in him. For all his tenderness toward her, Alexander's divine self-image had reached its peak. He now spoke openly of his own godhood, calling himself the son of Zeus Ammon. Then came the fateful fever. Accounts vary. Some blame poisoned wine, others heatstroke or infection, but all agree on one thing. Within days, the unstoppable Alexander lay powerless in his bed, unable to speak. Roxana stayed beside him as his voice faded to whispers. His generals came and went, begging for orders, but his hand gestures became too weak to command. On the 11th day, the conqueror of the world took his final breath in Babylon's palace. The empire fell silent. Outside, soldiers wept and tore their tunics. Inside, Roxana sat beside his body, her face veiled, her future uncertain. The woman who had united East and West through love now faced a new kind of battle. One not of swords and empires, but of survival in a world built entirely around the man she had just lost. When Alexander's body lay cold in Babylon, his empire, so vast it spanned from the Nile to the Indus, suddenly had no heartbeat. The conqueror, who had united East and West, left behind no clear air, only chaos and suspicion. And at the very centre of that storm stood Roxana, now a widow, and soon to be a mother. She understood immediately that her survival depended on the child she carried. If it was a boy, he could claim the empire. If not, she was doomed. The generals, once united under Alexander's command, now turned on each other like wolves over a carcass. Perdiccas, one of his top commanders, took charge of guarding the royal family, but even he had his own ambitions. Roxana, young yet sharper than many of the men around her, played her role with quiet cunning. Then came the most chilling moment of her life. Two other women also claimed to be Alexander's widows, Statira and Parysatis, daughters of Persian royalty. To Roxana, their existence threatened everything. If one of them bore a child, her own son's claim would mean nothing. And so, in a ruthless act that shocked even her allies, Roxana invited the Persian princesses to Babylon and had them quietly executed. Their bodies were never recovered. The empire fractured, but Roxana's place was secured. Months later, she gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. To the world, he was Basileus, the legitimate heir to the greatest empire on earth. To Roxana, he was both shield and burden. She moved constantly between garrisons, surrounded by soldiers loyal to shifting masters, Antipater, Cassander, and other warlords who tore the empire apart in the name of loyalty. Roxana's beauty had once charmed the world's most powerful man. Now her cunning kept her and her child alive, but even she must have known that her protection was temporary. The empire her husband built on dreams was collapsing under the weight of reality. Still, in every whisper of rebellion, in every rival's counsel, her name lingered. The Bactrian princess, who had seduced the conqueror and outlived him. For a time, she remained what Alexander had once called her, his little star, shining faintly amid the darkness that followed his fall. Roxana's final years unfolded like the slow fading of a legend. After Alexander's death, she and her infant son, Alexander IV, became living symbols, fragile reminders of a unity the world no longer wanted. The generals who once called Alexander their king now carved his empire into pieces, each claiming loyalty, while secretly plotting for their own crown. To possess Roxana and her son meant legitimacy. To destroy them meant freedom. At first, Perdiccas protected her, escorting her across the eastern provinces under heavy guard. She was kept in royal comfort, but it was a gilded cage. Every letter she sent was read, every visitor watched. When Perdiccas himself was killed during one of the endless power struggles, her safety evaporated overnight. Roxana fled westward with her child, seeking refuge under Antipater in Macedon. But even there, whispers followed her, that she was foreign, untrustworthy, a Bactrian temptress whose child was too young to rule. The boy was crowned king in name only, while Cassander, Antipater's ruthless successor, took control of Macedon. For a time, he pretended to protect them, housing Roxana and the young Alexander in Amphipolis. But as Cassander consolidated his power, the presence of a legitimate heir became an unbearable threat. Around 310 BCE, when the boy was barely 13, Roxana and her son were quietly executed, strangled in secrecy and buried in an unmarked grave. And so ended the line of Alexander the Great. The empire that had once promised to unite continents dissolved into squabbling kingdoms, each ruled by men who had once marched beneath his banner. Roxana, the little star who had once lit the tent of the world's conqueror, was extinguished without ceremony. Yet her story lingered, not as the tale of a queen or a victim, but as a symbol of empire's fragility. Through her, love and ambition had met in a brief, impossible harmony. She had watched Alexander rise to godhood and fall to mortality. She had carried his heir and paid for it with her life. In the end, she became what Alexander had once seen in her, a bridge between worlds, destined to vanish the moment the dream collapsed. The conqueror died conquering. His queen died remembering. For nearly a century, the monastery on Lindisfarne had stood as a beacon of peace and piety. Perched on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, it was a place where the rhythm of life was set not by swords or kings, but by the toll of the bell and the turning of pages. Monks in coarse wool robes rose before dawn to sing hymns in the echoing chapel, their chants carried by the sea wind. They illuminated manuscripts in silence, bending over parchment lit by flickering candles. The air smelled of salt and ink, and the sound of gulls blended with whispered Latin prayers. To the outside world, Lindisfarne was more than a monastery. It was a symbol of divine order. Its relics, its library, and its sanctuary made it one of Christendom's northern jewels. The monks, who rarely saw violence, lived under the protection of both Heaven and King Ethelred of Northumbria. To them, the idea of danger arriving from the sea seemed as absurd as sin itself entering paradise. But in the summer of 793, the horizon began to shimmer with a strange omen. Fishermen were the first to see it, shapes on the water, dark and low, gliding faster than any merchant ship. At first, they thought them traders from across the North Sea, maybe Danes or Norwegians bringing furs to barter. But as the vessels drew closer, the illusion shattered. Their hulls were long and sleek, their prows carved into dragon heads. The oars moved with brutal precision, cutting through the waves like blades. Inside the monastery, life continued unaware. A scribe was illuminating a golden letter G when he heard the first distant horn. Low, alien, and full of hunger. The seagulls screamed and scattered. Moments later, the shore exploded in shouts. The longships grounded on the sand, and the first wave of warriors leapt into the surf. Tall men, bearded, armoured in leather and iron, the monks who ran to the windows froze. These were not merchants. They carried axes, spears, and shields painted with beasts. Behind them, smoke began to rise. The men of Lindisfarne had never seen such savagery. The North Sea had delivered not traders, but a storm, and it would change Europe forever. They came like ghosts out of the mist, their longships gliding effortlessly across the waves, slender and low, designed for both speed and terror. Each prow bore the snarling face of a dragon or serpent, its wooden fangs biting into the air. The Vikings had timed their arrival perfectly. The tide was high, the monks distracted with morning prayers, and the heavens still veiled in soft grey light. No army guarded Lindisfarne, no walls defended it. The sea itself had always been their only protection, and now it had betrayed them. The longships scraped against the shore, their hulls hissing in the wet sand. The warriors leapt out, barefoot, shield in hand, axes glinting with sea spray. They spoke in a language that sounded like thunder, their voices booming across the quiet fields. To the monks watching from the monastery gates, it was as if a horde of demons had risen from the sea. For the Vikings, this was not just a raid, it was a test of their god's favour. They had crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean, guided only by sunstones and ravens, following the whispers of sailors who spoke of fat monasteries rich with gold, silver, and helpless men of faith. To them, the abbey was not sacred. It was ripe. They believed the Christian God was weak, a foreign spirit that let men shave their beards and hide behind books. They would prove him powerless. As the first Viking set foot on Lindisfarne, he raised his axe toward the sky and roared a prayer to Odin. Behind him, his comrades echoed the cry. It was a terrifying chorus, a promise of plunder, of blood, and of glory. The monks rang the bells, hoping to call for divine help, but the ringing only marked their location. Within moments, the raiders were upon them. Some monks tried to flee toward the cliffs, others clutched crucifixes, whispering psalms through trembling lips. The air filled with the clash of metal and the screams of the dying. To the Northmen, it was victory. To the monks, it was the apocalypse. On that bleak morning of 793, the dragon-prowed ships brought not just warriors, but the dawn of a new age. The monastery that had once echoed with hymns now rang with the clash of steel and the cries of the dying. The invaders stormed through the gates like a tide of fury, their axes cleaving through wooden doors and human skulls alike. Monks, unarmed and untrained, scattered like frightened birds. Some tried to bar the chapel doors, others clutched relics as if the bones of saints might ward off blades. But faith could not stop what was coming. Inside the church, candles flickered wildly as the Vikings burst in. A scribe who had spent decades illuminating scripture was cut down where he stood, his blood spilling across the pages of the Gospel of John. Gold chalices, crucifixes, and jewelled covers were ripped from the altar. The raiders laughed as they tore down tapestries, their rough hands grabbing anything that gleamed. To them, this was not desecration. It was conquest. The god of the north had triumphed over the god of the south. Outside, the sea wind carried the stench of fire. The wooden roofs began to burn, black smoke twisting into the grey sky. The Vikings moved methodically, dragging prisoners toward the ships. Some monks were slain outright, others were bound with rope, destined to be sold in distant markets along the fjords. The survivors who hid among the rocks could only watch in horror as their sacred island was stripped bare. To the Northmen, it was the perfect raid. No army to resist them, no fortifications, only wealth and glory. They had struck the richest monastery in Northumbria, and they had done so with the precision of wolves. As the flames consumed the monastery, the abbot, old and trembling, fell to his knees in the courtyard. His voice cracked as he prayed for mercy, his eyes reflecting the inferno devouring the church. When the Vikings found him, they spared no pity. The last thing he saw was the dragon-headed prow of a ship, gleaming in the smoke like the mouth of hell itself. When the longships finally pushed off from Lindisfarne, the island was silent again. The waves lapped against blood-stained stones, and the gulls circled above the ruins. In a single morning, the heart of English Christendom had been broken, and the Viking Age had begun. When word of Lindisfarne's destruction reached the mainland, it travelled faster than any ship. Fishermen brought tales of blackened ruins, of monks slaughtered in their cloisters, and of northern devils who came from the sea. The people of Northumbria could hardly believe it. Lindisfarne was not just another monastery. It was the spiritual heart of England, a place sanctified by St. Cuthbert himself. If even Holy Cuthbert's Island could fall, then nowhere was safe. In towns and villages, the stories grew more dreadful with every retelling. "The sea vomited forth serpents," said one terrified witness. "They came with swords of lightning," said another. Some claimed they had seen omens in the sky, red clouds shaped like dragons, moons that bled, and storms that howled with the voices of demons. Priests warned that this was God's punishment for sin, for kings who had broken oaths, and for priests who had grown fat on tithes. The apocalypse, they said, had begun on the North Sea. King Ethelred of Northumbria was humiliated. His reign, already unstable, now seemed cursed. His warriors were scattered, his coastline undefended. The monks of Lindisfarne had been men of peace, unarmed, unready, and now martyred. The king sent envoys to warn other monasteries, urging them to fortify their churches and move their treasures inland. But few believed such horror could happen again. Surely, they thought, the Northmen would vanish back into the sea. But they did not vanish. The Vikings had tasted wealth and weakness, and they would return. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of barbarism. It was a message. To the Norse, it proved that the soft lands of the south were ripe for plunder. To the English, it was a shattering revelation that the world they knew, ordered, Christian, stable, could be torn apart overnight. The monks who survived the massacre carried with them the relics of St. Cuthbert and wandered the countryside, seeking shelter. Their silence spoke louder than sermons. Europe, once sure of its faith and its walls, now trembled before a new kind of enemy. One that came not to conquer kingdoms, but to steal, burn, and vanish before sunrise. Lindisfarne was not just a tragedy, it was a warning, and Europe had only begun to listen. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of savagery. It was the spark that ignited an age. In the cold fjords of Norway and Denmark, word spread quickly. A monastery across the sea had fallen easily, its treasures taken, its monks defenceless. To the Norse, it sounded like a challenge from the gods themselves. They called the land across the water Englerland, rich, soft, and waiting. The young men who had once fought each other over narrow valleys now turned their gaze outward. They built more longships, sleek, shallow vessels that could sail rivers as easily as seas. Their prows, carved with dragons and wolves, became emblems of fate. Each voyage was a gamble between glory and death, but glory was what they lived for. The sagas later spoke of them as sea kings, men who sought not just gold, but eternal fame. For the kingdoms of England, the attack at Lindisfarne felt like a wound that refused to heal. More monasteries were struck, Jarrow, Wearmouth, and Iona. Each time, the raiders came from nowhere, struck with precision, and vanished before help could arrive. The coastlines that had once been peaceful were now places of dread. Bells that once called to prayer now tolled in warning. The church saw divine wrath in every wave. Bishops wrote letters filled with horror and prophecy. One chronicler, Alcuin of York, lamented, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The heathens desecrate God's sanctuaries, shed the blood of saints around the altar, and destroy the house of our hope." But to the Vikings, this was destiny. The fulfillment of what their poets called weird, the turning of fate's wheel. They saw themselves not as villains, but as chosen by Odin, blessed by the sea gods for daring where others feared to sail. And so, in the decades that followed, the dragon ships kept coming, not just to raid, but to settle, trade, and shape the destiny of Europe. Lindisfarne was their first roar, a strike that echoed across centuries. What began as one bloody morning on a lonely island would grow into an era that would forever be remembered, the age of the Vikings. In the years that followed Lindisfarne, a strange new terror haunted the dreams of Christian Europe. The Vikings were no longer faceless marauders from the sea. They were the embodiment of chaos itself. To coastal villagers, the mere sight of a black sail on the horizon was enough to send entire towns fleeing inland. Even the prayers of the church began to change. Monks added new pleas to their liturgies. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. The fear spread faster than the raiders themselves. Rumours claimed the Vikings were giants, demons in human form who could not be killed by ordinary weapons. Others said they worshipped devils, offering blood sacrifices before battle. Their speed, their silence, and their savagery seemed supernatural to those who had never seen warships glide so swiftly across the waves. Yet behind the terror was genius. Viking longships were masterpieces of engineering, shallow enough to sail up rivers, light enough to be dragged across land, and strong enough to cross oceans. They could appear anywhere, in England 1 month, in Ireland the next, and in France before the year was over. No coastline, no church, and no king could prepare for them. The monasteries, once symbols of faith and peace, became their favourite targets. They were undefended, wealthy, and filled with gold reliquaries and silver chalices. But beyond the treasures, the Vikings also took slaves, men, women, and children, who vanished into the slave markets of Scandinavia and beyond. The Northmen had turned war into an economy. Europe's kings were humiliated. They ruled on land, but the sea belonged to the raiders. Even mighty Charlemagne trembled when reports reached him of northern fleets prowling the coasts of Francia. He ordered watchtowers built and coastlines fortified, but he knew the truth. The Vikings were not an army. They were a storm. Every raid brought new converts to fear and faith alike. Churches filled with terrified peasants begging for divine mercy, while poets whispered that the end of days had come. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Europe felt small and defenceless. The Vikings had found the West's greatest weakness, its peace, and turned it into their greatest weapon. To understand why the Vikings struck with such fire and fearlessness, one must step into the world of their gods, a world where glory mattered more than life itself. They were not driven by greed alone, but by a belief that fate, weird, had already written every man's end. Cowardice could not delay it. Courage could make it beautiful. Death in battle was not to be feared, but welcomed, for those who fell with a weapon in hand would be carried to Valhalla, Odin's hall of the slain, to feast forever among heroes. Before setting sail, Viking warbands held ceremonies that mingled reverence and brutality. Offerings of mead, animals, and sometimes even human captives were made to Odin, Thor, and Frey. The air would thicken with smoke and chant as the Gothi, the priest, cast runes into the fire to read the god's will. If the omens were good, they rode into the sea with laughter. If they were bad, they went anyway. For to defy fate was the greatest sin. This spiritual armour made them unstoppable. The monks at Lindisfarne saw only savages, but the Vikings saw themselves as warriors fulfilling divine destiny. When they raised their axes inside the church, they believed they were testing the strength of foreign gods. Each raid was both a battle and a sacrifice, blood for gold, death for glory. Their mythology fueled their endurance. In a world where even gods were doomed to die at Ragnarök, life was a brief spark between storms. To live timidly was worse than death. To die memorably was to cheat oblivion. So they sought songs, not safety. And Europe, in its comfort, was utterly unprepared for men who measured success in legends. To the monks, they were pagans damned to eternal fire. But to themselves, they were the chosen, guided by Odin's ravens, protected by Thor's hammer, and destined to carve their names upon the bones of the world. And so, the Viking creed spread across the North Sea. That courage defied gods, that memory outlasted death, and that fear was for slaves. Lindisfarne had been only the beginning. The gods of the north hungered for more offerings, and their faithful were eager to deliver. The raid on Lindisfarne was not just a battle between men. It was a collision between two civilizations that had never truly met. On one side stood Christian Europe, a world of monasteries, relics, and the written word. On the other, the Norse, a people who worshipped gods of war and thunder, who carved their stories in stone and sang them beside roaring fires. When the longships came, they brought not only swords, but an entirely different way of seeing life, death, and glory. The monks of Lindisfarne believed that salvation lay in obedience and peace. Their lives were measured by prayer, by patience, by the careful illumination of holy texts that connected heaven and earth. The Vikings believed in motion, in the roar of the sea, in the honour won through action, in the songs that would outlive their bones. To them, stillness was death. To the monks, it was virtue. Between these two worlds, there could be no understanding, only fire. The Viking raid was therefore not just an act of greed, but of revelation. The Northmen saw what Europe had to offer: gold, land, and kingdoms divided by faith and politics. The monks saw what the North could unleash, a fury that could burn even the holiest of places. And both sides learned something they would never forget. Over the following years, more raids would follow, but the memory of Lindisfarne remained unique. It was the first strike, the first awakening, the first time that the North announced itself to the world. Chroniclers wrote of it as a warning, that God had allowed pagans to punish the faithful, that sin had brought the serpent to the shore. But in the long halls of Scandinavia, skalds sang of courage and victory, of Odin's favour, and of men who dared what others feared. It was the beginning of a dialogue written in blood, the sword against the cross, the saga against the scripture. And though centuries would pass before these worlds began to blend, Lindisfarne marked the moment when they first touched. The monks called it judgment. The Vikings called it glory. History would remember it as the day Europe met the North. Long after the ashes cooled and the monks' voices fell silent, the name Lindisfarne still trembled on the lips of Europe. Chroniclers wrote of it with horror. The harbinger of heathen fury, they called it. In parchment and ink, they captured the disbelief of a continent that had thought itself safe. The shock of 793 echoed through cathedrals and royal courts alike, shaping the continent's imagination for generations. The raid became more than a memory. It became a myth. To Christians, it was a test of faith, proof that God's protection could be stripped away when men grew complacent. Priests used it to stir repentance. They preached that the Northmen were divine punishment, scourges sent to remind kings and commoners alike that earthly riches were fleeting. In every new Viking raid, the ghost of Lindisfarne returned, a grim reminder that no coast, no altar, and no crown was secure. But in the north, the story took a different form. Among the fjords and longhouses of Norway, skalds sang of the brave few who crossed the whale road and struck fear into a kingdom of monks. They spoke of courage and cunning, of warriors who faced the unknown and returned with silver and glory. Lindisfarne was not tragedy. It was triumph, the first mark on the map of destiny. In time, the Vikings who once burned churches would build them. Their descendants would settle in England, Ireland and Normandy, marrying the people they once raided, shaping a new Europe from conquest and kinship alike. But the spark that began it all, that morning when the dragon-headed ships appeared through the mist, would never be forgotten. Centuries later, even as the Viking Age faded into legend, Lindisfarne remained its beating heart. The bones of St. Cuthbert were reburied with reverence, the monastery rebuilt, but its scars endured, a reminder that history changes not with armies, but with moments of fire. The raid on Lindisfarne was not just the dawn of the Viking Age, it was the moment Europe awoke from its medieval sleep, blinking into a new and brutal light. From that day on, every wave that touched the northern shores carried with it an echo. The echo of the storm that began on Lindisfarne. Long before the shadow of Rome reached the Balkans, the Illyrians lived in a world ruled by rhythm. The rhythm of birth, death, and the endless return of life. To them, fertility was not simply the act of producing children, it was the sacred pulse that kept the world turning. Every field that bloomed, every stream that swelled, and every woman who bore life was seen as part of one great breathing spirit, the earth herself. The Illyrians were mountain people, farmers, herders and warriors, but also quiet observers of the natural world. They believed that life was woven through invisible threads connecting humans, animals, and the land. When a storm broke over the Adriatic or the Drin Valley, it was not chaos. It was the earth renewing herself. The thunder was the voice of gods demanding respect, and the rain was the touch of divine fertility falling upon their fields. In Illyrian villages, fertility was both celebrated and feared. The people depended on the generosity of the land, but they knew that life and death were twins. Each harvest festival carried undertones of passion and danger. Dances, feasts, and rituals performed to please the unseen spirits that lived beneath the soil. Women, in particular, held a sacred place in this cosmic balance. They were seen as mirrors of the earth, mysterious, powerful, and bound to cycles of creation that even warriors could not control. Unlike later societies that separated the divine from the human, the Illyrians saw no such boundary. The divine was within them, in their blood, their seed, their dreams. Fertility deities, often represented by serpents, bulls, or women with exaggerated hips and breasts, symbolized not only physical creation, but the very power to sustain existence. The serpent, coiling endlessly upon itself, became the perfect emblem of renewal, shedding its skin as the earth sheds seasons. This deep reverence for fertility shaped Illyrian identity. To live was to honor the earth. To love was to participate in her eternal cycle. And through ritual, tattoo, and sacrifice, the Illyrians reminded themselves that every act of union between man and woman, sky and soil, was an echo of the gods' own creation. Their world was not one of sin, but of sacred desire. At the center of Illyrian spirituality stood the goddesses of fertility, powerful primal figures who governed both the womb and the world. They were not distant deities gazing coldly from the heavens, but living forces that pulsed beneath every stone and river. The Illyrians did not worship them with fear, but with deep intimacy. These goddesses were mothers, lovers, protectors, and destroyers, the full cycle of life embodied in feminine form. Archaeologists have uncovered clay figurines from Illyrian settlements across the Western Balkans. Small idols with broad hips, rounded bellies, and snake-like bodies. They were carved not for beauty, but for power. Each curve represented abundance, each serpent coil, the unbroken rhythm of creation. To the Illyrians, the serpent was not a symbol of temptation, but of regeneration. It slithered through the dark soil and returned each spring, reborn from its own skin, a living metaphor for the earth's fertility. The most revered of these divine figures may have been Prende, the goddess of love, marriage, and the warmth of the sun. She was the Illyrian counterpart to Aphrodite and Venus, yet far older in spirit, less the patron of romance and more the guardian of life's renewal. Women prayed to her for conception, safe childbirth, and the strength to endure the cycles of nature. Offerings of flowers, honey, and milk were placed on stone altars, while fires were lit on hilltops in her honour. But Prende was not alone. Behind her loomed darker, earthier spirits, goddesses of soil and decay, of caves and serpents. They ruled the hidden realms where seeds slept and ancestors whispered. To the Illyrians, fertility required both light and shadow. Every harvest demanded the death of the grain before its rebirth. Life was not given freely. It was wrestled from the earth through ritual, blood, and devotion. Men, though fierce in battle, bowed to these goddesses in reverence. Women carried their image in tattoos and amulets, believing the divine feminine flowed within their veins. Every birth was a reenactment of the world's creation, every woman's body a sacred landscape. The Illyrians did not need temples to find their gods. They walked among them, breathing through the soil, the fire, and the body itself. Among the Illyrians, no symbol captured the mysteries of fertility and sexuality more deeply than the serpent. It slithered through their myths, their art, and their graves, an eternal presence coiled around both life and death. The snake was not an enemy of humankind, but a divine companion, a messenger between the world of the living and the unseen. Its body, smooth and endless, mirrored the curves of rivers, the spirals of creation, and the cycle of renewal that defined Illyrian belief. In Illyrian sanctuaries, archaeologists have found serpentine motifs carved into pottery, weapons, and even the foundations of homes. To them, the snake was more than a totem. It was an ancestor, the spirit of the earth itself. It moved silently through the soil that sustained them, disappearing in winter only to return when the world awoke. For the Illyrians, that return was sacred proof that death was never final. Life always found its way back. The serpent also carried an unmistakable sexual meaning. It was the embodiment of male energy, penetrating, potent, and unpredictable, yet always tied to the nurturing power of the female earth. In fertility rituals, men and women invoked the serpent together. Men painted or tattooed its form along their arms and torsos, while women wore serpent-shaped jewellery around their hips and breasts. The joining of their bodies was seen as a sacred reenactment of the union between sky and soil, rain and seed. This balance between masculine and feminine energies lay at the heart of Illyrian cosmology. Neither could exist without the other. The serpent reminded them that passion and creation were not sinful forces to be tamed, but divine tools through which the world sustained itself. Even their burial sites reflected this belief. Snakes carved beside the dead as protectors, ensuring the rebirth of the soul into the cycle of nature. Over time, this symbol of sacred sexuality would be demonized by later faiths, its divine role forgotten beneath layers of myth and fear. But to the Illyrians, the serpent was holy, a whisper from the earth, a promise that creation never truly ended. It shed its skin, as they believed all life must, to be born again in endless, fertile renewal. Fertility among the Illyrians was not merely a natural event. It was a sacred performance, a rhythm that tied the human body to the pulse of the earth. Every season carried its own ceremonies, from spring sowing to harvest, each blending sensuality, gratitude, and reverence for the divine powers that governed creation. These rituals were not hidden in temples, but lived out in fields, rivers, and mountains, under open skies, where the gods could see and the earth could listen. Spring was the season of awakening. When the snow melted from the Dinaric peaks, Illyrian men and women gathered for festivals celebrating the return of life. Fires were lit on high ground, symbolizing the sun's strength returning to the land. Young women danced barefoot through smoke and water, invoking the goddess Prende for fertility and love. They wore garlands of wildflowers, their bodies painted with red ochre, the colour of blood, warmth, and vitality. Red was sacred. It was life made visible. In some regions, the rituals turned more intimate. Couples were encouraged to join in sacred unions during the festivals, believing that human passion mirrored the earth's own renewal. Sexuality, far from being taboo, was seen as an offering to the gods, an echo of the cosmic union between sky and soil. The joining of lovers was not indulgence but participation in divine creation. Offerings followed, baskets of grain, milk, honey, and animal sacrifices. The blood spilled into the soil was believed to feed the spirits beneath, ensuring abundance for the coming year. Priests and wise women guided these ceremonies, chanting invocations in forgotten tongues that bridged human breath with divine will. Even in marriage, echoes of these ancient rites survived. Illyrian weddings included symbolic gestures of fertility, the groom gifting a plough or a sheaf of wheat, the bride circling the hearth 3 times to honour the goddess of home and womb. To the Illyrians, fertility was not just about crops or children. It was the very act of keeping the world alive. Every seed planted, every kiss shared, every offering made was part of a grand exchange between humans and the divine. Life was sacred, and desire was its holiest prayer. Among the Illyrians, the human body was not seen as something to conceal or shame. It was a living altar, the vessel of divine power. Especially for women, the body symbolized the earth's creative energy, capable of bringing forth life, healing, and continuity. Every curve, every rhythm of the female form was tied to cosmic cycles. The waxing and waning of the moon, the changing of seasons, the birth and decay of the natural world. When a girl came of age, her transformation was not hidden away in secrecy, but celebrated as a sacred event. This passage into womanhood was often marked by ritual tattooing, an ancient Illyrian custom found among tribes across the Balkans. The tattoos, made with soot and natural pigments, were applied on the hands, arms, and chest in geometric and spiral patterns. These marks were not ornaments of vanity, they were spiritual seals, protective symbols, and declarations of maturity. To the Illyrians, these tattoos were blessings from the Earth Mother. Each line carried meaning: the spiral for rebirth, the diamond for fertility, the snake for divine protection. A woman's tattoo was her dialogue with the spirits, a visible testament to her role as both nurturer and priestess of life. Some tattoos were applied during festivals of fertility, others were tied to marriage, conception, or childbirth. The pain of the needle was accepted as sacred, a small death that opened the door to transformation. Men also bore tattoos, often serpent motifs or solar symbols to signify virility and strength, but the practice was most intimately tied to women. For them, tattooing was not decoration, it was identity. It announced to the tribe that the bearer had entered the mysteries of creation, carrying the power to give life, to heal, and to protect. These symbols connected generations. Mothers passed them to daughters, ensuring that every new woman carried the wisdom of the old. Even centuries later, faint echoes of these designs survived in Balkan folk art, embroidery, and ritual markings, whispering of a forgotten matriarchal reverence. For the Illyrians, the body itself was divine scripture, its skin the parchment of gods. To mark it was not desecration but devotion, a way to write the sacred language of life directly upon one's flesh. To the Illyrians, the act of love was more than passion. It was communion. They believed that human desire mirrored the creative forces of the gods, that when two bodies met, the boundaries between mortal and divine briefly dissolved. Love and fertility were not private matters of the flesh, but sacred ceremonies that echoed the harmony of earth and sky, rain and soil, moon and tide. In Illyrian cosmology, every union between man and woman was a ritual reenactment of creation itself. The man represented the celestial, the sun, the storm, the fire that awakened life, while the woman embodied the earth, the fertile ground where that fire took root. Their joining symbolized not dominance but balance. It was the meeting of two cosmic principles: energy and matter, seed and soil, giver and receiver. During seasonal festivals, these beliefs took living form. Villages gathered to celebrate the marriage of the gods, personified through human lovers, chosen to represent fertility and prosperity for the coming year. The couple would share a symbolic feast of milk, honey, and bread, foods believed to hold the life essence of the land. Their union, whether real or symbolic, blessed the earth with renewed vitality. When rain came soon after such rites, the people would say that the gods had accepted their offering. Illyrian sexuality was never divorced from spirituality. The body was not a vessel of sin, but a temple of divine rhythm. Even intimacy between lovers carried an element of ritual. Gestures invoking protection from serpentine spirits, whispered blessings to the goddess Prenda, and prayers that pleasure would bring fruitfulness, not shame. They saw pleasure as sacred energy, a spark of the gods themselves passing through human flesh. For the Illyrians, to deny the body was to deny the earth. They did not separate desire from the sacred, they fused them. Every kiss, every birth, every harvest was part of the same eternal cycle of life returning to itself. In this worldview, sexuality was not corruption. It was creation in its purest form. Through flesh, they touched spirit. Through love, they honoured the gods. And in their joining, They believed the world itself was reborn, again and again, in endless sacred renewal. Across the rugged Illyrian lands, from mountain valleys to coastal cliffs, there were places where the veil between worlds felt thin. These were the domains of the spirits of the earth, unseen guardians who governed fertility, health, and the vitality of the land itself. The Illyrians believed that beneath every tree root and stone dwelled a living presence, sometimes nurturing, sometimes jealous. To live well, one had to live in harmony with these forces. Shrines were rarely grand structures. They were carved into caves, built beside springs, or marked by standing stones covered with offerings. Women seeking conception would visit sacred wells at dawn, leaving tokens of cloth, shells, or drops of milk. Men would bring weapons or coins to the same places, asking the spirits for strong harvests and virile offspring. Water, earth, and fire all played their part. The holy trinity of the Illyrian world. Some of the most sacred sites were serpent shrines. There, worshippers left carved figurines of snakes and bowls of honey and eggs, gifts to the spirits who slithered unseen through the soil. The serpent was said to carry prayers between worlds, curling from the underworld to the realm of the living. To harm one was to risk divine punishment. Even homes often had a small altar where the household spirit, sometimes imagined as a snake, was fed with milk and bread. Priestesses and wise women tended these shrines. They were mediators between human and spirit, guiding fertility rituals, interpreting dreams, and prescribing charms for conception or protection. Their power was both respected and feared. The people believed they could bless a barren field, or curse it to stone. These rituals remind us that Illyrian religion was not confined to temples or scripture. It was embedded in landscape. The soil was alive, and every interaction with it was spiritual. The act of planting a seed, of lighting a hearth, or of lying with one's lover was infused with reverence for these unseen forces. Through offerings and whispered prayers, the Illyrians maintained balance between body, spirit, and land. Their world was one where every root had a soul, every spring had a guardian, and every heartbeat echoed the deep living rhythm of the earth itself. To the Illyrians, life and death were not opposites. They were partners in the same eternal dance. The same earth that nourished crops also swallowed the dead, only to return their essence in the form of new life. Death was never final. It was a shedding, a transformation, much like the serpent casting off its skin. Fertility, therefore, was not just about birth. It was about the continual renewal of existence, the sacred rhythm that bound generations together. Burial practices reflected this deep understanding. Archaeologists have found graves where the dead were interred with vessels of grain, milk, and honey, offerings to sustain the soul on its journey back to the underworld. In many tombs, small serpent figures coil beside the bodies, guarding them as they slept in the womb of the earth. Women were sometimes buried with jewelry shaped like snakes or spirals, reminders that even in death, their power to give life was eternal. The Illyrians saw death as a return to the mother, the vast, breathing earth who both bore and reclaimed all living things. Funerary rites often included fire and water, the twin symbols of purification and rebirth. Families would light torches to guide the departed spirit, then pour libations of wine or milk onto the ground, feeding the unseen world below. Mourning was not silent despair, but ritual acknowledgement, a recognition that life and death fed one another in an endless cycle. Even festivals of fertility carried traces of this awareness. During harvest time, the Illyrians thanked the gods not only for life's abundance, but for the sacrifice that made it possible. They saw that every seed that sprouted did so because another had decayed. Every birth, every joy was shadowed by loss. And yet, this was sacred balance, not tragedy. This acceptance of death gave their fertility cults profound depth. Sexuality, fertility, and death were all expressions of the same divine power. The movement of energy through different forms. Nothing was wasted, nothing was lost. The Illyrians lived by this truth, that every breath belonged to the earth, borrowed for a brief moment and then returned. To die was not to disappear. It was to become fertile once more, part of the soil that would feed the living. Though centuries have buried their temples, scattered their bones, and erased their language, the Illyrians left behind something indestructible, a spiritual echo. Their reverence for fertility, their union of body and earth, survives quietly in the folk traditions of the Balkans. It lingers in the songs sung at weddings, in the spring festivals of fire and water, and in the embroidered symbols that still adorn traditional garments, serpents, spirals, and suns. These are not mere decorations. They are the fingerprints of a vanished faith. Even long after their lands were conquered by Rome and their gods replaced by new names, the Illyrian vision of life endured beneath the surface. The church built its sanctuaries over old shrines, but the people continued to bless the soil, pour wine for the spirits, and tie red threads for protection, rituals older than Christianity itself. The Earth Mother, the Serpent, and the fertility goddess were reborn in new forms. Saint Prenda became Saint Venera, and sacred wells became holy springs. The names changed, but the meaning remained. Life, renewal, and the sanctity of desire. What made the Illyrians unique was not only their devotion to fertility, but their refusal to separate the sacred from the sensual. They understood something the modern world has forgotten, that creation requires passion, that life emerges from union, and that to revere the earth is to revere one's own body. Their rituals were reminders that humanity and nature are not rivals, but reflections of each other. Even today, in the quiet villages of Albania, Montenegro, and Bosnia, echoes of their worldview still breathe. Women tattoo crosses or dots on their hands, remnants of ancient Illyrian markings meant to protect and bless fertility. Farmers greet the first plough of spring with wine poured into the soil. Newlyweds circle the hearth 3 times before entering their home. These are not coincidences. They are memories passed through blood and ritual. The Illyrians are gone, but their spirit endures, in fire, in water, in the fertile soil beneath our feet. Their story is a reminder that before gods ruled from heaven, the divine lived within the earth and within us. And though their temples have crumbled, the sacred desire that once guided them still beats quietly in the human heart.